We do want to turn to the other major political story of the hour. One day after President Trump's State of the Union address and 1 week until the first major primary elections of the midterms. As the question remains whether the president can give his party the messaging boost it needs, particularly on that all-important issue of the economy. Today, Vice President J.D. Vance insisting the answer to that question after last night is a resounding yes.
Do you have enough runway to get this economy where it needs to be before November?
Well, Bill, in some ways we are pushing a car uphill because the Biden administration left us such a disaster of an economy. So I think that we've got a lot of momentum here. But the president said this last night. We inherited a mess. Our ask to the American people is let us continue to fix this mess, make your life better. That's what the president is prioritizing, and that's what we're going to keep doing.
In his remarks, which broke the record for the longest State of the Union ever, the president spoke repeatedly about issues tied to affordability. But he notably offered little acknowledgement of the financial frustration many Americans are still feeling or his slipping approval numbers on the issue. Instead, presenting a triumphant portrait of his administration's actions and casting blame on former President Biden and Democrats.
Our nation is back, bigger, better, richer, and stronger than ever before. It is indeed a turnaround for the ages. Their policies created the high prices. Our policies are rapidly ending them. We are doing really well. Those prices are plummeting downward. Just hold on a little while. We're getting it down. And soon you will see numbers that few people would think were possible to achieve just a short time ago.
It comes as polls suggest Republicans have a significant enthusiasm gap to close with voters with the midterms approaching. 65% of Republicans say they will absolutely vote in November, compared to 79% of Democrats. That's according to a new Washington Post poll. Although Democrats have only a slight lead on the question of which party's candidate voters are more likely to support. But the margin for Democrats grows among those all-important independent voters. Joining me now is senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez again, senior national political reporter Sahil Kapur on Capitol Hill for us, and national correspondent Aaron Gilchrist is talking to voters in Georgia. Gabe, let me go back to you. What's the reaction been from the White House today?
Yeah, certainly a lot to talk about here on this Wednesday, Kristen. Well, look, the White House officials that I've been speaking with today have been calling the president's performance, in their view, a grand slam. Of course, that's not surprising. What else would you expect them to say? But they really feel that the president made his case to the American people. He promised a long speech, said he had a lot to talk about it, and indeed, it was a record-breaking speech in terms of length. Now, they don't see this president not being empathetic enough. He's not a warm and fuzzy guy when it comes to these types of things, and he functions best, in their view, when he really tries to, brag about his accomplishments. The first half of this speech was dedicated to the economy. Of course, critics have said that it didn't really have many new policies. Most of the policies he did reference were not new and had been referenced before and didn't really have a whole lot of specifics. But they point to what he did talk about, this idea of corporations, calling on Congress to ban corporations from buying up single-family homes and try and lower the cost of home ownership. And also speaking about another policy, giving workers without 401ks access to retirement plans that were similar to those that federal employees have. So the White House officials that I've spoken with, they do say that he did make his case despite any criticism about not speaking and not being empathetic enough when it comes to the economy. One last point, Kristen. You heard the vice president in an earlier interview today asking Americans to let them continue to fix the economy. For the most part, the president tried to make the argument that, hey, we inherited a mess, but we've already fixed it. So they're going to have to figure out that type of messaging over the next few months ahead of the midterms. By the way, those first primaries less than a week away, Kristen.
Yeah, we will be covering them for sure. It's going to be a big moment. Let me turn to you, Sahil, on Capitol Hill and ask you about one of the new proposals President Trump did put forward. This wasn't a speech that was heavy on new policy proposals, but one that stood out was where he said the federal government will match the retirement savings donations of average Americans, basically setting up savings accounts like employees with the federal government have. I asked Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent about that last night. Let me play a little bit of that and get your reaction on the other side.
We can do it through reconciliation. And again, this is the president coming back for working Americans, those who've been left behind, the ones who don't have the 401ks. Certainly the federal employees, Congress, get all these benefits, and we will be rolling that out in the coming weeks and months.
Sahil, give me the reality check. Do you think that that can pass through reconciliation, which would allow Republicans essentially to pass that without Democratic support?
So conceptually, Kristen, this is the type of idea that has gotten bipartisan support in Congress in recent years. This project that Secretary Bessent and President Trump are pitching is actually modeled on a law that President Biden signed in 2022 called the Secure Act. And it would basically create a retirement account for those who don't have 401ks through their employer and have the federal government match it. The problem is that would require President Trump to actually work with Democrats to get this done, and he has not shown really an indication to engage in that level of negotiation on his economic agenda. Now, in terms of reconciliation, I think Secretary Bessent kind of showed his hand early, which is that the president is not going to try to get bipartisan support for this. He's going to try to have Republicans do this on their own, which is extremely unlikely. Republicans have gone back and forth with each other about the idea of a reconciliation 2.0, and the general consensus I've picked up is that it's not going to happen, Kristen. The margins are even smaller. They barely got the big, beautiful bill through. They shot their shot with that when President Trump's popularity was at an all-time high. And at this point, it's going to become a Christmas tree. Everyone's going to have projects of their own, and Democrats are more empowered now to try to mess with a bill like that. Very unlikely to happen.
Sahil, based on your conversations, what's the reaction been from Republicans to the president's speech last night? Are they feeling more emboldened heading into the midterms?
It's a mix, Kristen. One thing they do think President Trump is good at is as a salesman, selling their accomplishments. They know they're going to have to sell the big, beautiful bill. They know they're going to have to sell his border crackdown and make voters believe that things are better as a result of him being in power. What was missing from President Trump is any real acknowledgement of the pain that working class Americans are still feeling. His poll numbers have tumbled on the economy. They're deep underwater now. For the first time in his entire decade in politics, in 3 elections, he had break-even or positive views on handling of the economy. That is gone now. Even on immigration, the DHS killings of 2 Americans in Minneapolis have led to many Americans believing that his ICE and immigration enforcement operations have overreached here. So there was no real acknowledgement in those things, which are driving a lot of the Democratic advantage in the run-up to the midterms. And I think that's where Republicans worry that you can't just message your way out of that problem. People have to feel, especially on a pocketbook level, that their lives are better. And President Trump did not acknowledge that. The question is, are they going to be able to deliver something to voters between now and the midterms?
Yeah, I think that is the big question. Aaron, speaking of the voters, let me turn to you. I know you've been talking to voters in Georgia. What are they telling you?
Well, Kristen, I'm going to let you hear from a couple of voters that we talked to both last night before the speech and again today after the president's speech. And we're here in Fayette County in particular because this is an area that is a red county. It's one that went for Mitt Romney back in 2012 by more than 30 points, but for Donald Trump in the last election cycle by only 3 points. And so it's becoming less and less conservative over presidential cycles in the last decade or so. And the people that we talked to last night Democrats told us they wanted to hear a State of the Union speech that was hopeful, one that was made an effort to unite people's different perspectives. Republicans we spoke to said they wanted to hear a speech that was heavy on details about what the president has done for the economy and what he intends to do on the future. In both cases, we heard that people felt like the president missed opportunities with the address that he gave last night. Here's a little bit of what we were told by voters here in Fayette County today.
But I heard sarcasm and unaccountability, no apologies. I wanted to hear maybe about Iran or Greenland or Venezuela. He didn't apologize to people. He hurt. I mean, he laughed at people losing health care. That to me is unbelievable. That's not a precedent. No, I think this is going to make more people come out. We're not going to have a democracy if we don't show up.
I'd give him an A for content. I think he hit a lot of things. Iran, I would have talked a little bit more about. I would have been a little more specific about immigration. I think ultimately we're going to see how the economy works out. It always comes back to, what am I paying for groceries? What am I paying for gas? And can my kids get a good education? Those are generally what these elections hinge on. And I think we're going to have to see how the Republican proposals fall out before the midterm election.
Now, we also heard from other voters who didn't want to go on camera necessarily, who said that they did not watch the State of the Union address because they didn't want to have to sort of parse through information that was going to be useful for them in decision making going forward, and things that were more for the show, more for an audience to make an opinion about whether they like or don't like the President of the United States. We also heard from some Republicans here that they wanted the president to really drill down on the trickle down, if you will. They didn't want to hear so much about tariff policy and so much about things that were sort of easy for economic professors to understand, but things that people could really boil down and understand at the kitchen table, if you will, Kristen, something we talk about so often. And what we heard from Republicans is that the president didn't really simplify his message enough for folks who don't have lots of degrees or don't get into the weeds on these things all the time. And that may make it harder, Republicans here think, for them going forward into the midterms, Kristen, to make the president's case for him.
Well, it's just fascinating, Aaron, to hear your interviews and to hear the perspective of the voters, because ultimately it is about the voters. Gabe, let me turn to you finally and just ask you about the president's comments on Iran. I thought it was notable. He was very clear that his preference is diplomacy, but he was also very firm in the fact that the United States will not allow Iran to move forward with a nuclear weapons program. Is the administration saying anything about which way the president is leaning when it comes to a potential military strike against Iran? And we know there are going to be those critical diplomatic talks tomorrow.
Well, I was just going to mention those talks, Kristen. That is something that the administration is waiting on. And look, over the past several days, we have been trying to get from White House officials some inkling on the president's thought process on this. And yesterday, you mentioned during the speech, he did bring up that he preferred a diplomatic solution here. But then significantly, he also referenced this idea that, according to him, Iran was somehow working towards building a missile that could soon reach the United States. That's not something that we were tracking. We've been trying to get more information from White House officials on that today. Previously, the Defense Intelligence Agency had said that that was something perhaps the Iranians could achieve by 2035. So it's unclear what, if any, new evidence the president may have been looking at for him to make that assertion in yesterday's State of the Union. Again, we hope to ask the president about that. But certainly the vice president was asked about this earlier this morning, and he's reiterating what the president's message, what the administration says is the president's message, that he's been crystal clear that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. And while the president does prefer a diplomatic solution to this, he's ready to take military action if it comes to that. Kristen.
All right. Gabe, Sahil, and Aaron, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Joining me now is Republican Congressman Mike Kennedy of Utah. Congressman, thanks so much for being here.
Kristen, thanks for having me on.
Really appreciate it. Let me start off by getting your reaction to President Trump's State of the Union address, the longest in history. Started off talking about the economy. Do you think he laid out a blueprint for Republicans to campaign on in the midterm?
Absolutely. God bless America. It is the greatest country in the history of the planet, and we're able to see that vision from President Trump. We brought in our gold medalists from the Olympic Games. The hockey team did extraordinary things against all odds, and they were able to bring back the gold. In addition, we recognized our soldiers who have put their lives on the line for the safety of the American people. And I just am so impressed with the people of America. As a freshman legislator, it is a real privilege to represent my constituents, but I tell my team all the time, I represent my constituents, the state of Utah, I represent the United States of America, and the opportunity for people to be free. And President Trump is America first in every step he takes. He's trying to fight for the American people. And I know there's problems. There's an infinite number of problems. And it will keep us occupied for the rest of our lives trying to solve those problems. But myself and sensible Republicans and Democrats, there's ways for us to find opportunities to work together to fix these compelling problems so that the American people benefit.
Well, I want to get your reaction to what the Wall Street Journal wrote about this speech. They write, President Trump told a national audience on Tuesday that he had unleashed a new age of American prosperity. One thing he didn't say, I feel your pain. Do you think that was a missed opportunity? Should he have shown more empathy with those Americans who still don't feel like the economy's working?
I'm a doctor, and I'm a big fan of empathy. That makes a big difference when we're like that. But here's the fascinating thing about the doctor world that I live in. Some doctors are not very empathetic. They do the job. So I'll take the example of an emergency doctor or somebody that needs to have their appendix out. Is you don't need, when you're in critical circumstances and your appendix needs to come out, you don't need somebody who's going to be soft, warm, and cuddly and trying to do this work. You need somebody that's technically able to do that job. And when President came in and inherited the Biden disaster that we've had over the past 4 years, and I think about the doctor circumstances that it takes time when you move forward in a positive direction and you're trying to do the right thing. If somebody needs that appendix out, get them ready for surgery. You got to bring them back. It takes time for this process to happen. And if the American people can be patient a little bit longer, the big, beautiful bill is in process. And when people get their tax refunds and they see that they're $3,000 to $5,000 ahead from where they were last year, just based on the big, beautiful bill, they will be happy about that.
Do you acknowledge, though, what so many Americans
Absolutely,
say, that they feel like there's an affordability
Yes,
crisis?
and when we talk about inflation under Biden was 9%, and now it's down to 2.4%, is we should say congratulations, but there's still a lot of work for us to do. So absolutely, my constituents and I, we hear plenty from all sorts of people about the various issues that they confront. I want those problems to be resolved, but it does take time for us to execute on these plans that are going to actually make things better.
I want to ask you about some numbers I referenced at the top of this show. If you look at the midterms, more Democrats than Republicans said they are certain to vote this fall. Here are the numbers. 66% of all voters say it. 79% of Democrats compared to 65% of Republicans. How do you close that enthusiasm gap, and how concerned are you about it, Congressman?
We know angry people like to get out to vote, and we totally, on the Republican side, we understand that. We are the party that's in charge at this point. People recognize that. We also have to deal with the fact that we have a 53-seat majority in the Senate. We have 7 Democrats on the Senate side that we need to get on every bill that we pass. So there's a collaboration that needs to go on here, but I and my colleagues take seriously the fact that we need to make sure that the American people understand that we're on the right track. And I suspect, and that's where the big, beautiful bill passing last July, that was a big deal because we passed the biggest tax cut in the history of the United States of America at that point. That's not going to be felt until this tax season right now. And people are going to notice the differences in that, their own personal economy and the economy generally, as they start to see the economy explode in a positive direction over the next several months.
Well, let me ask you about the state of play right now in the House. Obviously, I don't have to tell you this. The margins are
very slim.
Incredibly slim. There's a lot of focus right now on one of your colleagues, Congressman Tony Gonzalez, allegations that he had an affair with a staffer who tragically went on to take her own life.
Which is tragic.
Absolutely tragic, by setting herself on fire. There are growing calls for him to resign, including from some Republicans. Now, Congressman Gonzalez has said he's not going to resign. He says that the public has not seen all the facts, and he believes this is a political hit job. Given what is publicly available, though, Congressman, do you think that Congressman Gonzalez should resign?
The fact that the American people, his constituents, in the next week can render an opinion about that, what really matters is, do those people want to put this man back into office? That's all that matters. The opinions of various other people who say what they think about these sort of things, I'm not a voter in his district, and I believe that those people should render that opinion, not me. These accusations in the United States of America, you are innocent until proven guilty. And I know everybody wants people like me to say statements about all sorts of other people, but I'm just going to withhold judgment because I don't have all the information at this point. We need to get as much of that information out as possible, as fast as possible, so people can make that decision in his district.
One of your colleagues, Congressman Massey, is saying that House Speaker Mike Johnson, who has not called for him to resign, is being nearsighted, is trying to protect his majority. I understand what you're saying, which is that you want to see all the facts play out first. But is there a point to that? And is there anything that's disqualified?
I'll just ask Representative Massey, what information does he have that other people don't have that makes him rush to judgment as to this circumstance? This tragic death should be acknowledged, and it's a devastating impact for his family, especially. Goodness sake, for these poor people with this young woman who took her life. And I just say, this is something that if Representative Massey has additional information, he can come to me in the Republican conference and tell us what that is so that we can render judgment more accurately.
Let me ask you about the government shutdown. There's a school of thought that the president would deliver his State of the Union address, and then perhaps that would encourage both sides to come together, get a deal. Do you think it's time for Republicans to agree to some concessions so that DHS can reopen?
Shutdowns are a disaster. Republicans executed on that years ago. It was a disaster for them. Democrats in the past 4 months have shut the government down now twice. And I think it's a reflection of the fact that they don't seem to have a policy. They don't have a way forward themselves. The only thing they can do is make sure TSA, Coast Guard, and FEMA are not funded. This is a funding appropriations package that the House sent over to the Senate weeks ago, and we've already approved it. The Senate was in agreement until the Schumer shutdown folks saw an opportunity politically to try to score political points. I think it's shameful. We need to pay those government workers for the work that they're doing. And I think the Schumer shutdown needs to end yesterday.
One final question. President Trump is weighing potential military action in Iran. Do you think he needs to come to Congress first and make his case?
I'm always a fan of information because people hold me accountable for these decisions, and I don't have as much information as I want to answer those questions. I also recognize, Kristen, this is sad, is when the president tells us things, sadly, it all goes directly to the press, and so nothing is confidential. And if President Trump needs to do things to protect the United States of America, and America first is his primary objective, and he knows that he can't tell us until after because of leaks. That's our fault, not his fault. But I'm a big fan of the president conveying as much information to people like me so that we can explain it to the American people as to why it's compelling that we do any military action in Iran.
Congressman Kennedy, thank you so much, and thanks for being here in person after a
pleasure.
very late night. We
Thanks for
really
having me.
appreciate it.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.